My name is Olaf Skjenna. I'm a physician specialized in aviation and space medicine. I trained in the University of Alberta, and I was sponsored by the Canadian military. And as a result of that, I owed them a few years afterwards, which I gladly did. I loved the military. I've always been interested in aviation since I grew up in Medicine Hat during the war, and of course that was one of the major training bases. And I remember watching all of these little yellow airplanes flying around, making a heck of a racket over Medicine Hat, sometimes buzzing the houses and that type of thing. So I've always loved aviation. The first flight I ever had, I was 4 years old, and it was a oh my God, what do you call them? Not a flying circus. A barnstormer. It was a barnstormer who gave me my first flight when I was 4 years old. I remember it vividly, and I swore at that time that I was going to be a pilot someday. And I didn't really have a chance until I graduated from high school. I tried to get into flying training, and the Air Force was not taking pilots at that time. They said you had to have a degree, so I said, well, I can't afford to get one, what can I do? And they said, well, you can maybe go through the ROTP, which I tried, and I finally got in after a couple of years when I couldn't start university because I didn't have enough money. And in order to go through the medical officer training plan, you needed to have at least 1 year of medicine after your pre-med. So at any rate, I got a job. I had trouble finding work, and I got a job in a medical lab. And although I was really interested in physics before, I became interested in medicine as well. And I decided that I would like to try to become a doctor, and I did. In fact, I went through the undergraduate medical subsidization plan that the Air Force had, the military had, and they paid my way through, and I owed them a few years afterwards. And it was a wonderful program, and I highly recommend this program to anybody who is thinking of becoming a physician, because it removes one terrible burden, which is the burden of debt, that you can run up huge amounts of debt going through medical school. It's now called the MOTP, and I'm not advertising it, but I'm telling you about it because it's a very, very good program. So because of that, eventually I had been stationed in Cold Lake and was able to get a couple of trips in T-Birds and 104D in the back seat. And that just cemented it more and more, the love of flying. And afterwards I was posted, after I interned in Saskatoon, I was posted to Rivers, Manitoba. And at one time we had a joke amongst the MOTP people that the worst place in the world that you could be was Rivers, Manitoba. But it turned out to be a wonderful posting. And one of the things that they did was they said, well, how would you like to learn how to fly the L-19? So I said, well, yeah, let me think. Okay. And so I went through the L-19 program. And then the L-182, and the Beech 18. Then we were posted to Portage la Prairie when the 4FTS moved to Portage la Prairie. And there'd been a number of helicopter accidents. The Hiller 12E Nomad was the training helicopter that was used by the military, Canadian military, as their basic trainer, and it was a difficult airplane to fly. In helicopter terms, it was the hardest that I'd ever flown. But they were having a number of accidents with these, including a friend who died in a crash, caught fire. And so they asked me if I would go through. And I said, well, let me think. Okay. And so I started on the helicopter training course, and I went through. They thought maybe there could be some human factors involved in these accidents, and sure enough there were. And so I wrote a series of papers about the what I found in the human factors area, and at any rate got my qualifications. I still hold a commercial helicopter and fixed wing license, but at any rate, the University of Southern California, the professor there, got a hold of a couple of the papers, and he said, well, look, if you put this together in a book, and by this time I was out on Civvy Street, and I was actually doing civilian accidents, which were very frequent in that era. And so I put it together, wrote what experience I'd had also with Civvy Street, and it became used as a textbook at the University of Southern California. So that's how I got my start in teaching. And also then I was invited by Stockholm, Royal Technical Institute in Stockholm, to assist with their courses, their annual courses in flight safety and aircraft accident investigation, which I did there for 14 years. I spent 20 years going down to Los Angeles for the courses there at the University of Southern California, which are quite well-known courses. So that's how I got into the accident investigation part and the human factors part. I had become very, very interested in that. And one of the things that I had done is when I had planned on staying in the military, but the Department of Transport offered me a job as a regional aviation medical officer in Winnipeg. And if I would take the job, they would send me to England for postgraduate work at the Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine. So I left the military reluctantly. I had signed a permanent commission, but I left, and the lure of going to England to study aviation medicine was great, and so I have no regrets about that. It was a wonderful program. Also, I spent some time at the Royal Air Force Institute of Tropical Medicine and the Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Pathology. So that's where I gained background in the accident investigation. Plus, I worked on over 100 accidents over a period of time. That's where that comes from. And I had been involved in aircraft accident investigation for many years. I've worked on over 100 investigations. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the story of CF-PAB, which was a Locheed L-188 Electra that crashed up at Rae Point in Northwest Territories, or now Nunuvet, in 1974. Okay, well, the story begins in 1974 on, let's see without my glasses. The story begins in November 1974, when I was living in Winnipeg, and I was part of the central region of the Department of Transport, part of the GO team for aircraft accidents in that region. In fact, in Northwest Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Northwest Territories. This particular day, November 1974, the phone rang about 4 o'clock in the morning. I had just gone to bed. I'd been to a lecture at one of the centers. I believe it was Alvin Toffler who was giving a presentation on the future. But at any rate, I managed to get a couple of hours sleep, and the phone rang, and lo and behold, there was a kind of a sleepy voice at the other end of the phone that said there's been a major accident up in a place called Rae Point, way far north Canada, and it's reported that there were 32 fatalities on this particular flight. Would I be ready within 2 hours to take off from the airport in Winnipeg to fly to Calgary? The aircraft belonged to PanArctic Oils, which was 49% owned by the Canadian government, and this was Rae Point was an exploration camp up in the high Arctic, where they're searching for oil and natural gas, and so the camp had been built up there. Most of the buildings that were there had been flown up in the back of Hercules aircraft, and they were built by ATCO. But at any rate, so I appeared at the airport, and we headed to Calgary, which is the head office of PanArctic Oils, which owned the aircraft. And we were given a briefing then, and then we climbed aboard CF-PAB, which is another L-188 Electra, and headed north. First of all, we stopped in Edmonton to pick up some extra passengers, and then we took off and headed up to Rae Point, which is about a 4.5-hour flight. It's very, very far north. In fact, it's so far north that compasses are totally unreliable up there. You can see a compass swing of 90 degrees within a couple of hours. So therefore, any navigation had to be done by ADF or sun compasses. So we arrived at Rae Point at around midnight, and I sat in the jump seat just so that I could see the approach, visualize the approach. I was a qualified pilot, and I had an IFR rating, and it was to see if there was something visually that had gone wrong that caused this aircraft to crash. We landed in Rae Point. It was extremely cold. There was a very high wind, and the temperature was about minus 52. So we first of all went to our particular cabin their bunkhouse where we stayed for the next few days. And the first thing in the morning, we had a meeting of everyone involved, and just a bit of a briefing about what had happened. Apparently the aircraft had gone down about midnight, and they had been 2 survivors, the first officer and flight engineer, plus 1 passenger who survived for a period of time but died on the way into on the way to Edmonton, where he was to receive medical attention. It was decided that we would head out onto the ice, and most people are pretty anxious when there are accident investigations to start kicking tin. And I kind of held them back a little bit, and I said, look, this has been fresh sea ice, which is only about 7 inches thick. And even at 7 inches thick, fresh ice, because of the saline in the ice can be quite soft and dangerous. In addition to that, we'd had a major aircraft accident that had hit on the ice about 3.5 miles short, or 3 miles short of the actual runway. So we decided that maybe we better take some safety precautions, and that really we should have a rope. We should be roped to the shore or to the pack ice in case anyone went through. In fact, most people did go through at some point or another. The worst thing was a wet foot, which is difficult to endure in that sort of temperature range. So we decided that we would go in teams. I was assigned to the identification team, where we would go in and find the victims and map their location and photograph the area as required. And what we found when we got to the site was absolute desolation. I mean, the aircraft was scattered all over the ice. There was 1 engine sitting on top of the ice. The other 3 engines had gone down. We were told that the cockpit had broken off and had slid down the ice about 900 feet and then dropped through and was on the bottom. The first thing that we did was we roped together in groups of 4 and then roped to the shore in case of somebody going through the ice. One of the things that they left for us, because there's a threat of polar bears in that area, was they left a couple of rifles leaning up against the engine that was on the surface. What they didn't realize, of course, was that you couldn't fire them. They were just frozen solid. So there we were. One of the things we noticed initially was there was a lot of small Arctic foxes running around the area. And one of the reasons that they were there was that the aircraft, amongst its, in its cargo, had 1,000 pounds of chocolate chip cookies, and these are scattered all over the ice. And the little Arctic foxes just loved these things. And so they were very tame. They didn't realize how destructive human beings could be, and so they were actually running around between our feet and so on. When they disappeared, we knew that we were on the menu for a polar bear, and so we had to be very careful about that, and that's one of the reasons that the rifles had been left for us. When we got out onto the ice, what had happened was that I was with 3 mounted police ident people, and we went around to the different bodies that were on the surface and mapped where they were and left a pin, a stake, when the bodies had been removed, so we could map it out later on. One of the problems we had was that the labels that we had were wire tied, and it was so cold that the wires just snapped like glass. We couldn't use them. So we tried using tape. We had some masking tape there, but again it was so cold that it wouldn't stick. So we ended up having to tie the labels onto the stakes with string, and of course that meant taking off our gloves. And in the cold, most of us got some sort of frostbite. One of the things that I had to do was to take photographs of where the bodies were in situ and also part of the wreckage. And that was a real problem because of the extreme cold. Now I had an Arctic parka, and what I did was I carried the camera in the parka behind my neck, where it would be warm enough when I pulled it out to actually work. And these were Asahi Pentax 35mm cameras, and I took a lot of pictures, and every single one of them turned out. It was just amazing. It meant that I ended up with some frostbite on my hands, but the pictures all turned out, which is incredible. So what would happen was we had to limit the number of people out on the ice. We had sent 2 divers ahead, roped together and then roped to the shore to lay out polypropylene rope to delineate areas where it was safe to walk and where we could have 1 person or 2 people or 4 people. Where a lot of the victims were, we could only have 4 people at a time. So I would go in with the team and we'd take the photographs, stake the area and label it, and then withdraw, and the next team that came in would remove the victims and take them into the morgue that was set up in Rae Point. There was a number of victims that were stuck in the ice, and there was a number on the bottom, including the captain, who was still apparently in the cockpit. Well, it turns out he was still in the cockpit. The 2 survivors were flown immediately to Edmonton before we got there. They were injured. In fact, the first officer lost both of his hands as a result of severe frostbite, and later on was actually able to get back flying because of the development of prosthesis, which allowed him to fly a twin otter. Where are we here? Yeah. So we recovered the bodies that were on the surface of the ice, and then also we wanted to find out what was on the bottom and find out where the cockpit was and whether there was wreckage scattered along. As I mentioned before, the cockpit had slid about 900 feet along the ice, and it had broken off just behind the cockpit, which is the usual case for long-bodied aircraft. Usually a long-bodied aircraft will break up just after the cockpit and behind the wing. And this was a typical breakup. Most of the aircraft was on the bottom. The 3 engines were on the bottom, which resulted in some difficulty in terms of trying to determine what settings were, etc. In order to map out the area, there were holes that were dug in the ice or bored in the ice about every 15 feet, and cameras were lowered down to take a video of the area. And this is how we located exactly where the cockpit of the aircraft was. And we determined that we would maybe, if we were going to recover anything from the body, from the bottom of the sea, it would be the cockpit. So the job of collecting the bodies, some of them were frozen in the ice, like I mentioned, and others were on the bottom. I worked with the ident team from the RCMP in chipping out the bodies from the block, from the ice. What happened was that they were frozen in the ice, and some of the what they did was they cut out blocks and brought them up onto the surface, and then we chipped away at the ice to get the victims out. It was a very tedious and heartbreaking task. There were about 7 victims in one of the blocks of ice. The ones on the bottom were easier to recover. One of the problems was that the water was about 110 feet deep, and we were concerned about the bends. So we had a hyperbaric chamber flown up from Vancouver. The divers were with a company in Vancouver, and were specialized in cold weather diving. And because of the problems with the temperature and the fact that we couldn't allow many people on the ice, what we did was we developed a kind of a large sheet of plywood nailed together, and there was a Quonset type of tent that was built up on the platform. And that means that we could have about 7 people there at one time. And at one end of the tent, there was a hole cut in the ice, and the physiological monitoring and vision equipment was set up at the end. So because you can't scuba dive in that cold water, the temperature of the water was about -4 Celsius, and of course we were concerned about the regulators freezing up. So they used what they called rat hats, and the rat hats were designed by this company in Vancouver. They also, because of the type of recovery that was necessary, they hired a person, an American, who had been instrumental in clearing the Suez Canal of wreckages after the war between Israel and Egypt. And he was very experienced in underwater recovery and supervised the recovery of the different parts. Because there was so much on the bottom, it was decided that we could not afford to bring it all up, so we would instruct the divers of what we wanted to see, for example, engine settings and that sort of thing, different parts of the aircraft, and they would go down and photograph it with the video camera, which we could observe live, and then take photographs with the underwater cameras to get solid film photographs, which were much more detailed. Because of the depth of the water, the divers' time was limited down below. One of the interesting things was the amount of life that was down on the bottom of the ocean in that area, like seals, for example. and every so often a seal would poke its head up through the in the tent to have a look around and see what these people were doing on the surface. The polar bears, well, once in a while we did encounter them, or they encountered us, or tried to. And on one particular occasion I was working with the Mounties, trying to chip out some bodies from a big block of ice. And all of a sudden the Arctic foxes disappeared, and I thought, okay, what's happening? I turned around and looked, and I could see coming towards me 3 black dots, which were the 2 eyes and the nose of a polar bear. And I was kind of alarmed about that, because I didn't want to become part of the feces of a polar bear. So the sergeant, who was the RCMP sergeant, who was really a legend in the North, I told him, I said, look, there's a polar bear coming up. He turned around and had a look at it, and then went back to chipping away. And I was kind of really concerned. I was getting frightened about this polar bear coming up, and I turned around and it was getting closer. I said, hey, Sarge, it's getting closer. And he'd say, oh yeah, okay, and chip away. And then finally, I said, I'm pretty alarmed about this whole situation. So he grabbed the shotgun and fired it into the air, and he didn't even look to see the polar bear run away. Let me tell you that these things can go really quickly. I had one run across the path behind me, and the path that led from the pack ice out to the wreckage site. And I heard this noise, and I turned around, and there was a polar bear chasing an Arctic fox. And it was fast. It was like a freight train. And I knew that there's no way we could ever outrun one of those polar bears. I went and looked at its paw prints, and they were enormous. They were bigger than my winter flying boots, for sure. So at any rate, we kept on working at getting the victims out and getting as much information as we could from the aircraft. And then the final thing that we did was we raised the cockpit. That meant chopping a very large hole in the ice and setting up a tripod with wood, and I don't know where we got the wood, but wooden poles, I guess, that had been shipped up there, and set up a tripod and block and tackle, and we pulled it up through the ice. And the problem, the object was to have a look and see if there was any movement of the control switches and that sort of thing. And this is notoriously inaccurate. Films that we had seen before that were taken by General Dynamics down in the desert, where they were crashing airplanes against the side of hills and that sort of thing, showing the cockpit, the switches would be going up and down, on and off, and things moving all over. So, but there was enough evidence there to determine where a needle slap was, for example, on an instrument. So also the captain was still in the cockpit, and so we recovered him. He was the last person that we did recover. So now we had a number of parts. Most of it still, as far as I know, on the bottom, 110 feet. And it was enough to give us some ideas. The important thing was that we had 2 survivors, the first officer and flight engineer. Cockpit voice recorder and the data recorder were not operable. They were very old type of design, and the foil that was in them to record whatever activities there were, and there was a limited number, I think only about 8 different parameters that could measure, plus the cockpit recorder, voice recorder. The tape was torn, and so we were not able to get very much information whatsoever out of the flight data recorders. But what we did have is we had the evidence of the first officer and flight engineer in the cockpit. And what they said when they traced the flight was that it had been basically an uneventful flight from Calgary to Edmonton, where they picked up extra passengers. And there was one passenger in Edmonton. When they searched his luggage before he got on the aircraft, they found a bottle of whiskey. And gambling and alcohol were absolutely prohibited up in those northern camps for very good reason. So he was kicked off the airplane, and in fact that bottle of whiskey saved his life, and I wonder if he still has it on his mantle or not. But the first officer and flight engineer were able to describe what had happened on that flight. It was about 12:30 a.m. When they were to make their approach to Rae Point. Their ETA was very close to that area, and they started their descent from 25,000 feet. Just before they started letting down, they had a steak dinner, and which may have played a factor later on in the what happened in the cockpit of the aircraft. They had a steak dinner. The limits for Rae Point were 450 feet and 1 mile. They set their altimeters to that. And they were about 6 miles out, and they still were having some difficulty seeing. There was an ILS with the glide slope and so on, and also a VOR. But the captain, when they reset their altimeters, he set his to 300 feet, his radio altimeter, and for an unknown reason. And as they approached the ice floes that break off and drift out, he proclaimed, we're above the clouds and must get below. Now here we are at 300 feet and traveling at the approach speed of about 130 knots or so. And he stuffed the nose forward to the point where the first officer and flight engineer were alarmed because of the negative G that they experienced. The first officer was relatively inexperienced, and this was the first time he'd flown this particular captain. The flight engineer was quite experienced in the company and with Locheed Electras. He was not a licensed pilot. He did have a private license, but their flight engineer at that time was a flight engineer, and that was it. He had control over the engines and also monitoring other parameters. And at any rate, they started shouting out the altitudes, and the first officer finally grabbed the controls and yarded back as hard as he could and pushed the power levers forward, but it was too late. The aircraft continued its descent onto the surface of the ice, and with the ensuing crash. Now, they had indicated to the radio operator at Rae Point that they would be landing at about 17 minutes past midnight, and that point, that time occurred, and there was no message from the aircraft. And it was an hour, almost an hour, before they finally decided that there was something wrong, and there was an RCMP Twin Otter on the site at Rae Point, and so they took off, and as soon as they took off, they could see flames in the distance on the approach path to Rae Point runway. And that's when they knew that it had gone wrong. And that's what possibly delayed some of the victims from not surviving. So we were up at Rae Point for over a week. It just seemed a lot longer. And then finally, and I ordered the bodies to be sent down to Edmonton and to have autopsies on all of them to see what kind of injury patterns there were, if there were any events that happened, any medical events, etc., that may have resulted or being contributed to the accident. I also hired Dr. Neville Crowson, who was at that time Canada's leading expert in crash pathology. In fact, in any military accidents or whatever, we're all shipped to Winnipeg to Dr. Crowson to do the post-mortem examinations. Dr. Croson then solicited help from some of the local pathologists to do the autopsies. And by this time I had flown down to Edmonton, and so I was there for most of the autopsies, including the captain of the aircraft. And it was just mainly the evidence of the type of crash that there was. In fact, some of it, they could have survived. Some of them were survivable, but due to a lot of circumstances, did not. As I mentioned before, one of them had survived and died on the way down to Edmonton. So I assisted with the autopsies. Now, one of the things that we were doing at that time was assisting. As everyone knows, Wilbur Franks was the person who invented the first G suit, the Franks flying suit, or anti-G suit as they called it, which was a water-filled type of suit. But he was doing a lot of research in other areas. And Wilbur Franks was doing a study, long-term study, looking at what he called awareness of mortal danger. And that is when a person is aware that they're in terrible danger, there's an adrenergic response where the adrenaline glands secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream. And this circulates around to different organs, and as it hits an organ, the organ goes into anaerobic metabolism. And of course it hits the organs at different times. It takes about 2 minutes for the blood to circulate all the way through. And so if you measure different organs and look at the lactic acid inside these different organs, you can get an idea of the timing, how long a person was aware that they were in mortal danger. And of course, because of this particular type of accident, maybe the information may become valuable, but at least it may concern an advance in research. I know that law enforcement and so on have been very interested in this particular type of study. But what we would do is that we were supplied with blue boxes with a thermos in them, a really high quality thermos, and we would take the bits of organ, like kidneys, whatever, and put them in a condom. And of course, because this was mass casualties, it was difficult to find enough thermoses for them, and even more difficult to find condoms that weren't lubricated. So we did manage that, and we were collecting the organs for each victim in a separate thermos. And these were dispatched to the Defence and Civil Institute of Environmental Medicine in Toronto, where the analysis was performed. At the end of the autopsy sessions, I was busy working with the other investigators trying to determine what had happened in a particular case. And we actually had hired an expert, one of Canada's leading experts in liver disease, Dr. Fisher, and we were working together. And my wife Pat had come up to Edmonton, that's where I graduated from, we knew people there, to visit and or be with me. And so I had a meeting scheduled one particular day, and so I asked her if she would mind taking the cameras, the Polaroid cameras that we rented from a camera shop back, and we were using Polaroid cameras for evidence. Plus, we were using the condoms for the collecting the organs. And so I had this box. I handed her this box of cameras, and I didn't realize that there were condoms in the box as well. And she went back to the camera shop and presented the owner with this box, and who decided he would count and make sure that everything was there. And so he saw the cameras, and then he saw the little boxes, and he opened them, and there was a condom. He said, "What's this for?" And my wife, who was a very demure, shy lady, said, "Well, my husband has used them to put organs in." And the proprietor said, "Well, I suppose he is, isn't he?" And so that was not quite the end of a marriage, but it was an exciting moment. At any rate, for various reasons, and for reasons that are sometimes well hidden, we never did do a proper investigation according to ICAO standards, the format that's used internationally for accident investigations. Instead, it became a public inquiry, and it seemed that the federal government was suppressing, or wanted to suppress, the information that was coming out, possibly because of the pilot who had severe liver disease. His liver was about twice the normal weight, and the microscopic examination showed that it was mostly fatty liver with inflammation. And this, we felt, could have been one of the contributors to the accident. It did not make any sense at all that this captain, at 300 feet and 130 odd knots, would suddenly bunt the aircraft, thinking that he's above clouds, interpreted the ice flow as being clouds. To us, it was an obvious incapacitation. And we had also an explanation now why it could be a incapacitation in having a liver that was very fatty and inflamed. And in fact, what can happen is that when you consume proteins, and the crew had a steak just before they started the descent into Rae Point. Some proteins are detoxified by the liver. The fact that it's detoxified means that they're toxic, and in fact some amino acids are in quantity. Normally the liver would detoxify these amino acids. And in fact, as Dr. Fisher pointed out, one of the common causes of death in alcoholics is protein poisoning. They end up in the hospital emergency, and they succumb to protein poisoning rather than just pure alcohol. We found out that the pilot actually had a hobby farm, and he was a young fellow. He was only 30 years old. Had a hobby farm, and he'd been cleaning implements with carbon tetrachloride, which of course is very hepatotoxic, and this may have been one of the contributors to his severe liver disease. The government was not happy with that particular type of report, considering that there's a possibility that alcohol could have been a contribution to the accident. And they took some steps to come up with some alternative fact or alternative explanation for what had happened. And that in itself is another adventure. The inquiry went on for about 2 years, and I worked on that one along with everybody else, plus other accidents in between, for 2 years, and then finally Dr. Stevenson, or Judge Stevenson, Judge Stevenson came out with a report about 2 years later, where he indicated that there was possibly liver problems, but didn't believe that contributed to the accident. It's really hard to find any kind of another explanation for that sort of erratic behavior in the captain. I think that if the first officer had been more experienced, and if they had cockpit resource management and followed the 2 communication rule, that probably this wouldn't have happened. But at any rate, that was the end of CF-PAB and the death of 32 young men who were geologists, engineers, very productive people. It was a terrible tragedy to those in the camp these were their personal friends. So